for authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me tonight is going to be Nick REDFERN. God, I don't believe I just went there. But at any rate, he's a very interesting gentleman. And a lot of people know who he is just when I mention his name. He's author of many, many, many books. He's been on. He's been part of the Roswell Festival on more than one occasion. He's been on TV before. I'd be surprised if people didn't know who he is. And he's also been a frequent guest on my show. And, well, me and Nick, I think we've gotten to know each other pretty good over the last few years that we've been talking together so much. So, Nick, how you doing tonight?
Hey, Royce, I'm doing good, thanks. How's things going with you?
It's doing pretty good. So, I actually got to get by today without using any heater or any air conditioner.
Oh, well, I've got the air conditioner sort of just pumping out here right now, and it was cold. We've had bad weather up until about mid-February, but now here in the Dallas area, the last 2 weeks it's sort of really heated up, and I think Sunday night, about 7:30, it was still 91 degrees outside, so pretty warm.
Yeah, it's had a couple pretty warm days, but it had a longer cool spell, I think, than usual, and a colder cool spell than usual. I was wondering if you thought maybe we could be on the cusp of a cool front, or like a global cooling, in other words.
Well, I mean, definitely. I mean, up till February, the apartments where I lived, that they were still telling us up to about February the 15th, 16th, to keep the taps running all night because it was literally still in Dallas, going below freezing, in the middle of the night in February. So, and that's not normally like that. We do get snow sort of December and ice, but not sort of mid-late February usually. So, it's definitely cooled off quite a bit. And actually, it's funny you should mention that, because I spoke to my dad a couple of days ago back in England, and he was saying that there's a frost warning coming for this weekend.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, I know it's pretty cool today, and it's supposed to be pretty cool tomorrow. Now, also, everybody, if y'all want to learn more about Nick, if those of you who don't know him or who do know it, just want to keep up with what he's got going on recently, you can go to www.nickredfern14.blogspot.com. And this is the first time in 2 or 3 shows I got it right, isn't it?
Yep, Nick Redfern, Fortean, Fortean. Yeah.
Okay. And we're going to be talking today about your book, For Nobody's Eyes Only, which is, one out of about 30, 40 books you've published so far?
Something like that, yeah. I think about 32, 33, something like that, yeah.
I know it's been a bunch. I mean, you're a fascinating writer. I got to hand it to you.
Well, thanks, Royce. I mean, I've been writing books for like 20 years, so it's not like I've cranked them all out in 5 years or something.
No, I guess. Well, there's only to me a handful of writers that do the same type of research and stick to the facts, and they don't get off in left field in a bunch of pipe dreams on it. And that's people like you, Bob Curran, Marie Jones, Larry Flaxman, Stanton Freeman. Y'all are some of the few that I think do some of the best work out there.
Oh, well, thanks. So what I always try and do when I'm writing a book is, I try not to insert my personal views or ideas when we're dealing with unknown stuff. What I try and do is report the facts more from like a journalistic perspective, sort of rather than offering opinions and comments and beliefs. I present the facts and the data, and then give the reader the opportunity to sort of make their mind up as to what they think. And the reason why I do that is because I think when we're dealing with something that's sort of definitively unknown, like the UFO phenomenon, or if it's Bigfoot or whatever I'm writing about, nobody has all the answers, because if we did, there'd be no need for books and TV shows or whatever. So we still have a lot of questions. And because we have a lot of questions, I think it's wrong to force a belief system on the reader when that belief system cannot be proved to be right. All I can do, and I think the right approach to take, is to present the data, and we try and make some conclusion from the data, but to sort of force feed the reader my belief or this idea when we're not able to prove it yet. I think that's sort of not the responsible way of doing it. You should take more of a journalistic approach of presenting the facts, not of trying to reinforce a personal idea or belief.
Agenda or ideology or...
Yeah.
Now, I know that in your particular case, also what you do when you do that is you leave the door open for feedback, which could actually help you solve something that's not proven yet.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're writing a book, you can only go with the data that you have in hand. And I always stress this to people, again, when we're dealing with unknown issues, or where we don't have the answers at least, that things could change overnight. This case could collapse, or one that people thought was a hoax for years could be proved to be real. And so, for those reasons, I think it's important, again, not to sort of get caught up in one idea. People often say, do you believe in this, do you believe in that? And I said, well, this is the data we've got so far. And it's not sitting on the fence. It's just that I'm honest enough to admit that until we actually have the hard evidence, we're just not sure what the answers are to this mystery or that mystery. Some people will tell you, oh yeah, there's crashed UFOs at Area 51. Well, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that there could be, but we don't have the hard evidence. And that's what I try and stress is that, yeah, let's investigate these really intriguing stories, but, don't 100% commit yourself in case it turns out that somebody's trying to, divert us away from something else. And that's why, when you talk about leaving the door open, you have to do that. That's the way I look at it. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, this is how far we've gone, but if anybody else has got something that suggests a different angle, and that's the one we need to follow, let us know. But there's far too many people in the UFO subject whose minds are closed. They say, yeah, it's this, that case is a hoax, this one's real, and they don't want to know any different. And for me, for me at least, when you in that angle, you've crossed the line from being objective to just being somebody who believes in something without having hard evidence of it.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that one. I mean, I've known for years that you never have to really prove anything until you actually know something. Yeah. I mean, as long as you say you don't know, what do you have to prove? The minute you start saying you know it, everybody's going to want you to prove it, and that's when you stick your foot in your mouth.
Yeah, I mean, it's like with the UFO phenomenon. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that there's a genuine unknown UFO phenomenon amongst us. But, when people say, oh, it's definitely extraterrestrial, some Zeta Reticuli, well, yeah, it could be. But it could be extraterrestrials from somewhere else. It could be interdimensional. It could be extra-dimensional. It could be time travelers. It could be some ancient hidden race from our planet masquerading as aliens. It could be military. It could be a whole range of things. All we know for sure is that there's a genuine phenomenon. But, beyond that, we've got a lot of theories, and that's what I try to stress to people is that we've got the indigenous humanoid theory of,
right.
a race that coexists with us that masquerades as extraterrestrial even, or us from the future, or us from the past, or, as I said, some other plane of existence. It doesn't necessarily, it may be extraterrestrial, but it doesn't have to be. But when people tell you it is, for sure, and they know, well, the fact is they don't know. They have a strongly held opinion, which is very different. They
think they know or they believe they know, but they don't really know.
Yeah.
So,
and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that, providing you admit that's what you admitted to believe. There's nothing wrong with having a belief in anything. But as long as you admit it's a belief and you don't try and present it and spin it as a provable fact when it isn't, then it's not a problem, providing you do take that approach.
True. Now, I want to also remind everybody, if y'all got questions, please call in at 832-632-7904. And what I usually do, folks, is I go ahead and answer the line because I haven't found a hold button on Skype, which is what I use yet. So I just answer the line and I wait to actually call you in. You can just kind of sit there and listen to the conversation until we get a break, and I'll just cue you when it's time. Now, getting to your most recent book, and Nick, I got to tell you, I read this book, and it was very, very fascinating, very eye-opening. I mean, I had never once in all my years of doing these radio interviews, to be honest with you, thought about destroyed or shredded or lost declassified files. I mean, you know, to me, they get to be a certain age, they declassify. I never even knew that there were, until I read your book, that there was different kinds of declassification depending on the type of material, which you explain in the very beginning of your book. I guess to start this off, why don't you tell everybody, pretty much give them a quick rundown of how the declassification system works?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of countries around the world have what are called Freedom of Information Acts, where members of the general public and the media can apply for files to be declassified in the event, you know, that they may sort of offer insight into historical aspects of how governments and military agencies work. And, I mean, to give you an idea, there are Freedom of Information Acts in the US, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in most of the Scandinavian countries, in Australia, in some of the South American countries. And they all broadly work on the same principle. Some countries have a situation where files can't be released until they reach a certain age, and then they come up for review. Other countries, it's the official story is that they should at least come up for review after no more than 25 years. But in the event that some of those files, if they were released, might compromise national security issues, they can be withheld for longer. For example, here in the US, there are quite a few files relating to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which are still classified. We don't know why exactly. It may be for some very obscure, totally down-to-earth reason. It may be that there are people mentioned in the files who are still alive, and you know, it might compromise their safety if the file was declassified. So, and other reasons for files being withheld are, you know, in case they reveal agents' names or information on the capability and the abilities of weapon systems that we obviously don't want to fall into the hands of enemy nations, that kind of thing. So very often it's files aren't withheld just for the sake of it or anything like that. There's usually a legitimate reason. But one of the good things about using the Freedom of Information Act, which I do, is that a lot of people sort of paint the government as the bad guys when it comes to all this. They're hiding everything from us, etc. But I've always found that when I've used the Freedom of Information Act, you know, people often say, oh, well, it's all lies, the material that surfaces, or it's all doctored and sanitized and so on. Yes, you do get sort of documents which are withheld or blacked out or whited out or whatever, but you also get an incredibly large number of really good files and intriguing material, you know, surfacing by, I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages. Very often people are so cynical, they just don't realize that we do get to see some good stuff. But the important thing is that we publicize this and get the stories out, that, you know, that we're being allowed to see. And that's the sort of approach I take. You know, I always sort of take what I consider the right way to do investigations, which is to apply for files, go to archives and things like that, you know, and do it the sort of the legal way and to demonstrate, which actually sort of adds credibility. You know, I know the UFO field is filled with sort of anonymous sources and alleged whistleblowers that their names have never been released. And yes, those stories are fascinating, but in terms of the sort of regular news media, they ignore them because they don't consider them credible. If they can't speak to the person, they don't want to know. And that's one of the problems we face, and that's why I use the files a lot, because I think when you can present an interesting formally classified US Air Force file, for example, on UFOs that perhaps was declassified, you know, a year ago, and it tells a fascinating story from 50 years ago of a pilot encounter with UFOs, that has credibility. And I think that's what we need within the subject is material that is credible, that it isn't just exciting, if you see what I mean.
I think I do. And I know that I read online all the time that, the government is trying to keep you from getting a hold of declassified files, and maybe in certain cases they are. Who knows?
I've never had a problem. I've never had a problem getting hold of declassified files. Files are already in the public domain. They're already in the public domain. For example, the FBI has got a really good website called The Vault, where you can find what I think is probably literally millions of pages of formally classified documents on literally hundreds and hundreds of different subjects, everything from Cold War attempts to find Russian spies to German spies trying to access U.S. secrets in the Second World War, people from Hollywood, gangsters, you name it. The FBI has done an excellent job of putting all this material on file, and it really does sort of tell a fascinating story of a massive amount of the FBI's research and work from the 30s right through to the present day. And when I say the present day, I mean they are releasing files that sort of relate to the last few years. For example, they released their file on people like Steve Jobs, who died not long ago. And so in some cases, it's not just old files we're getting to see new ones. But generally what happens is that the files are either released, either sanitized or in full, or you just don't get to see them. I've not seen evidence of sort of declassified files being pulled and being made hard to get once they've been released. It's just that they either get released in the first place or they don't.
Well, yeah, that's what I was fixing to say was that what I was talking about would be a rare case. And I was going to also say that you hear the same thing in the media, but it's been my finding that from time to time I catch the media covering some sensitive topics from time to time too, no matter what I see read online about them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think, it's like, for example, when you look at a file or whatever, and if it's been declassified officially, then that's sort of primarily, or that I won't say primarily, that's sort of really the only way I do things. But there are other stories where, for example, people talk about supposed classified files they've seen, and then that story gets out. For example, retired military people who claim to have seen files on Roswell, that sort of thing, which clearly aren't in the public domain. And those stories are fascinating because they do suggest, another part to history that we're missing. But the problem invariably is in these stories, it's not that the stories may not be credible. It's just we just don't know where to go to apply for those files. And when, for example, the agencies say, look, we've gone looking and we cannot find the files anywhere, then that sort of is makes the search for them even more difficult too, if no one can find them. And often I find that when attempts are made by members of the public in the UFO research community to get hold of, for example, files on Roswell, again, coming back to what I said earlier, a lot of people think that the Air Force is hiding the truth about Roswell, and that the Air Force are the bad guys and so on, and they're hiding all the facts and hiding all the alien bodies. I actually don't believe that at all. I don't believe today's Air Force is hiding anything about Roswell, period. What I think is that somebody is hiding the truth about Roswell, but I don't think it has anything to do with the military or the elected government. I think there's almost like a shadow agency that is pretty much answerable to no one, that is probably black budget funded. And when the Air Force spokespeople say, look, we went looking for our Roswell files, or any Roswell files, and we cannot find any, and we think it was just a balloon and crash test dummies, I don't think they were lying when they said that. I think they went looking, came away, found nothing, but felt the responsibility was on their shoulders to try and come up with an answer that might be the right one. And I think a lot of people in the UFO field viewed it as something very different. They viewed it as the Air Force lying to hide the fact that the people who put the reports out were actually the ones sitting on the secrets, and I don't think they were. I think, that most of the people in government don't know any more than we do. Most of them probably know less than we do. But that doesn't mean somebody else doesn't know. But I think, that the problem is we expect, or a lot of people in ufology expect the CIA or whoever to be the ones, where in the basement they've got 3 or 4 canisters containing, frozen bodies of aliens or the wreckage of a few flying saucers, when I actually think the people who we expect to be the ones sitting on the secret actually aren't the ones sitting on the secret. I really do think it's a group that is sort of quasi-attached to the government, but equally is its own entity and is answerable to no one. And most people in the government, possibly even, the highest levels of government, don't know anything about this group at all, because it acts in such a weird fashion,
It's like they've infiltrated and they got a few key people in key places that have the need to know, and everybody else is out in the dark and being accused of knowing stuff that they don't know.
Yeah, I mean, for example, the Air Force put out 2 reports on Roswell, one in 1994, saying they felt the wreckage was from a so-called mogul balloon used for spying on, for Russian, monitoring, for Russian early Soviet atomic bomb tests. And they put out another report in 97 saying that they felt that the stories of alien bodies were based largely around reports of people seeing crash test dummies fall to the ground. Now, I think there's enough data to suggest those theories actually don't answer the question. But here's the important thing. I don't believe those theories that the Air Force came up with were lies. I think, again, the Air Force went looking, couldn't find anything, but still, like I said before, felt a need and a responsibility to answer the questions. And so, faced with having done the searches and not having found any material, they went back to see what else was going on at the time and thought, well, maybe this is what it was, and we'll put it out. But they got painted as the bad guys. They got painted as the people sitting on the truth, and I really don't think they were. I really think, the problem is that if it's a semi-official agency, a lot of people don't realize that Freedom of Information Act just applies to government agencies, and that's it, or military agencies. If you've got an agency that is sort of established in a semi-official or unofficial fashion, but has sort of ties and is sort of black budget funded, but it isn't an official agency, technically it may not be covered by freedom of information legislation in the first place. So that would make it even more difficult to get the files, because something that people may not appreciate is that you cannot simply write to the CIA and say something like, please send me your Roswell files, because that doesn't cover the scope of what's required. You have to, when you pen a Freedom of Information Act request, you have to be very specific. I hereby request files on General John Smith, who was stationed at whichever ABC airbase between January the 5th, 1948 and March the 4th, 1952, and his social security number was, and he's buried at this particular location. Here's a photocopy of his birth certificate and his copy of his death certificate. Very often you have to supply all that, which means doing background research on the person or the subject to provide information to allow the search to go ahead. Just saying, send me your Roswell files, they won't even acknowledge. Well, they'll acknowledge it, but they won't be able to do a search on that. So.
Wow. And it's sometimes hard to get that background information.
Yeah, I mean, for example, if you go to the FBI, as I said, the FBI have been extremely good about releasing a massive amount of files. Now, say, for example, you wanted to, let's say you were researching an obscure UFO witness from 1953, but it was a great case, and you wanted to see if there was an FBI file on that person. Well, yes, if you've got the name, and let's say you've got an old newspaper clipping that tells a story, you could send that into the FBI, and they could do a search based on the information you've provided, but they won't do that search until you can prove that that person's dead. And the reason why is actually an understandable one. It's because that file, if it's on a living individual, a living U.S. citizen, then in theory, and actually in practice too, it could affect their privacy if you got hold of their file, which contained personal information that wasn't in the public domain. You see what I mean? It'd be kind of like somebody using the Freedom of Information Act to access your social security number and then putting it on the internet. That would be your private data that somebody else had got. So they won't allow you to access a file on someone until they're sure the person is dead. But the important thing is with the Freedom of Information Act, it's the onus is on the person making the request to find evidence that the person's dead. That's the thing. You have to provide. If you send a request in, they won't spend their time, because they've got so many jobs to do. They don't spend their time finding out if the person you're requesting about is dead. You have to prove to them that the person's dead before they will entertain the idea of seeing if you can have access to the file if one exists. So that would mean going through newspapers to try and find if you've got an idea when the person died but you haven't got proof, go through old newspaper archives from the town the person lived in, check the obituaries in the newspapers for that time period, see if anything was printed in the newspapers, and if it was, send them a copy along with a FOIA request, and that should hopefully do the trick. But if you don't do that, they won't even,
take the time of day.
They won't even attempt to, to fulfill the request because, as I said, in case the person in a worst-case scenario is 90 years old, still alive, and they release a file with the person's name and address on, and, that by the next week there's 40 UFO researchers knocking on this poor old guy's door or whatever, So that's kind of the reasoning behind it, which things like this are, there are legitimate reasons when you look into it as to why files are withheld. It's not just because somebody says we're just not releasing them. There are often very down-to-earth reasons as well. Right.
And like you said before, the biggest majority of the people working in there, they have no reason. They don't even know of anything that's going on. They're just told these are all the documents. This is how you find it. You know your job, do your job.
Yeah, and I think, again, I think people often have this assumption if you work for the CIA or whoever, you're suddenly briefed on what happened at Roswell and where the files are held and what really happened. It doesn't work like that. If you work for the CIA and your job is interpreting satellite photographs of, North Korean or Chinese missile bases, why would you would not be briefed on what happened at Roswell any more than I would, because it's not part of your job. So most people in the agencies are just sort of doing their best ability to perform the tasks that they've been hired to do. So, when somebody sends in a Freedom of Information request for a file on George Adamski, most people in the agency wouldn't say, oh, yeah, that's that famous controversial UFO guy from the 50s. They wouldn't know anything about him because it's not part of their job to know about the UFO field. It's their job to respond when you send all the information in, and then they start reviewing it, and they see there's a file on him, and, oh, yeah, this guy was a UFO guy in the 50s, and so they review the file and see what can be released. But, had you not sent that request in and had you not sent the background information to allow the search to go ahead, they would have had no more knowledge of who George Adamski was any more than I would have of, a guy who served in the U.S. Navy in 1956. You see what I mean?
Right. Or you would have never known who I was, for that matter.
Yeah, exactly.
You hadn't met me.
You research the person. So. And that's what the agencies have to do. Very often, if the file's so obscure and has never been declassified, and it's been stored for 30 years in the archives, in the vaults, they have to then pull that file and see what's in it. And unless you file the request, very often, the files can just sit there because nobody asks about them. That is one of the crazy things people don't realize. It's not that files are often just withheld from us. Sometimes they may have been declassified years ago, but because there was no sort of big fanfare or publicity when they were released, they might have just been sitting in an obscure box for 30 years. I found that at the National Archives in Maryland when I've been there, that there are files which had been declassified back in the 80s, and I went there like 2003 or 2004, and hardly anybody had looked at them because they were just so obscure, and they were contained, not hidden, not deliberately hidden, but they were just contained in a massive, boxes where the overall file ran to like 10, 15,000 pages, but there was a really interesting 20 or 30 page UFO report in there, which I don't think hardly anyone had seen because it was tucked away in an obscure sort of Air Force science and technology office cabinet, if you like, but it wasn't withheld, it wasn't hidden. It's just nobody bothered to look for it or stumble on it before. So you have that angle as well.
So you are allowed access to those old books that records you were just talking about if you go there in person, without having to have all the background information, maybe?
Yeah,
if you want to go look yourself, in other words?
If the files have already been declassified, but the agencies, that the archives are so massive that it would take a lot of time to go through them, you can go there. I mean, I've done that with the National Archives and a couple of presidential archives, but the National Archives is probably the best example. For example, that there are millions, literally millions and millions of files and documents and pages stored there. And many of those have been declassified, like I said, 20, 30, 35 years. But the problem is that what you often find is that, I'll give you a perfect example. The Research and Development Board, which was established back in the late 40s, they have literally hundreds of thousands of pages of documents at the National Archives. And at times, the Research and Development Board got involved in UFO studies in the early years. Now, the files themselves aren't titled like R&D UFO Report 1947. You may find that if one particular scientist, like Professor Jones, was, contracted by the Air Force, you actually might find that the files aren't listed as UFO files. They're actually containing Professor Jones's personal correspondence with the Air Force. You see what I mean? They might have got filed in his personal records rather than somebody opening an official UFO file. So in that sense, if you just read the overall title listings of all the files and it says Professor Robert Jones, Correspondence 1951, that tells you nothing. So you would have to review the file itself and read it and then you find, wow, this guy was involved in UFOs. So that's why it can be such a tedious task and why so many files don't surface. Not because they're hidden, but because most of us don't have the time or the manpower or the resources to just spend, sort of 6 months at the archives just doing nothing but digging through them all day long, which would probably drive you crazy anyway if you did. So.
But there have been some cases, haven't there, where documents have been destroyed before they could be declassified or something to that effect?
Oh, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of interesting, that's the whole thrust of the book is, so when you're dealing with government files, people often, or for most part, write about files that have been declassified and we have access to. And I thought about, well, why not try and turn things on its head and write about the files that have vanished or which can't be found, but where we know that they did exist. And a classic example is Roswell. And it also relates to why I don't think, again, the Air Force are the bad guys when it comes to Roswell. When in 1993, the congressman for New Mexico, Stephen Schiff, he began pressing various agencies of government to release any files they had on Roswell, because being the congressman for New Mexico at the time, he'd heard a lot of stories about what supposedly happened at Roswell, and he tried to get to the bottom of it, and he actually tasked the General Accounting Office, as it was called at the time, but it's called the Government Accountability Office today, to look into Roswell. And the GAO is actually a very powerful agency that has the ability to go knocking on the doors of pretty much any agency of government and say, we want your files on this particular subject and you will hand them over. And all the agencies did searches and said they couldn't find anything at all. But the Air Force actually came out with something as well. Not so much what they couldn't find files on Roswell. What they turned up was the fact that all the outgoing messages from the Roswell Army Air Force Base, the old base at the time, from 45 to 50, were gone. They just could not be found anywhere. Now, that's not to say there was evidence that they'd been shredded or destroyed or burned or they'd been, turned over to Area 51 or somewhere. There was nothing like that at all. what they actually discovered was that the files were just gone. That there was no evidence to say where they'd gone or under whose jurisdiction or authority. But the important thing is, what a lot of people forget, is it was actually the Air Force who brought this to people's attention when the GAO launched their inquiry. So in other words, if the Air Force had been the bad guys, I think the last thing they would have done was to highlight the fact that the files were, for all intents and purposes, suspiciously missing. They would have kept quiet about it. The fact that they openly said, well, the files are gone, we don't know what it means, but they're not there, I think that's a good pointer that they were telling the truth. But this is one of the things I talk about in the book, is that why I think there's some sort of shadow group is because even the agencies today, like the Air Force, they're baffled by the fact that these files from 47, 46, 49 from Roswell cannot be found when arguably they should be found. So somebody has the ability, to sort of move in and grab this material. And we find the same thing with the Rendlesham Forest case in England, the famous UFO landing in December 1980. There are actually British Ministry of Defence documents which surfaced a couple of years ago, internal documents between the staff, where they'd gone looking for the Rendlesham files and found there was this, to quote them literally, there was a huge gap, as they worded it, in the Defence Intelligence files from that period of December 1980 relative to the Rendlesham Forest case, which could not be found and still cannot be found to this day. So this kind of leads me to believe, and granted it's a theory, is that I don't think, as I said, the Air Force or the CIA or whatever, and the same with the British Ministry of Defence in England, I don't think they're the ones hiding the facts. I think there's almost like a global shadow agency or group that is responsible for acquiring all this material. And when you kind
sort
of
like the Illuminati?
something like, when people talk about the Illuminati, like some sort of ancient secret society or secret group that has strands and tentacles all around the world, and that is so powerful, it doesn't need to have ties to government. Now, of course, yes, the military of any country would have to be the people who sort of recover the crashed UFOs, when they come down, etc., etc., and who would be responsible for taking them to certain installations. But then I think that's when the military's role today at least ends, that they don't know what goes on after they take the material to this installation, some fortified base in the desert or whatever. Then it falls into the hand of the sort of private corporation that oversees everything. And I think that's when, even the government hits the like a front door, so to speak, in the same way that we do, and neither of us can get past it. And it's for a lot of people, it's a strange concept to try and get your mind around, the idea that there's a cover-up, but the government doesn't know, and the government doesn't know why these files are missing. But that really does seem to be the picture we have, as bizarre as it sounds.
It ain't so bizarre after all. I mean, I know that I've looked online and I've seen reports of a president or two who's actually come out and either hinted or out and out said that there was a shadow government.
Yeah.
Presidents who said it. They're dead now, but I mean, I remember seeing it posted online.
And I think the important thing to remember is when we say like a shadow government, that even still implies, that it's sort of official and elected in some fashion. I don't think it is. I think it's sort of like a loosely knit, tied group of people, but who are so powerful, they still have the same abilities, but are to a far more secret and stealthy level as the elected people. I want to give you another example, moving away from UFOs. There have always been rumours for years, well, actually for decades, that back in the 1940s, and possibly even earlier, that British intelligence, particularly MI5 and MI6, which are the equivalents of the FBI and the CIA, that MI5 and MI6 secretly employed, off the record, the famous occultist Aleister Crowley. And the reason being that because Crowley was someone who was tied in with a lot of people and travelled the world a lot, he could be sort of used as like an undercover spy. And if he was stopped by enemy nations, he could say, I'm here doing my occult research or whatever. I'm here to do a seminar. And he would act as a good cover. And he did a bit of sort of, overseas spying for British intelligence. Now, just a couple of years ago, we actually got confirmation that there were MI5 files on Crowley, certainly extending through to the 1950s. And that was fascinating. It would have been more fascinating if we could actually see the files, because all we've got, excuse me, is an internal note in one of the old MI5 files that references the existence of the files. But when MI5 went looking for them, they said, well, we can't find them. We're presuming they got destroyed years ago. But like with the Roswell files, no one can say why they were destroyed. And MI5 seems legitimately baffled by it. So again, this makes me wonder if a lot of these sort of files on weird mysteries, whether UFOs or people dabbling in the occult like Crowley, if they all kind of end up in the hands of this classified group, that wouldn't surprise me at all. And I think the way that would probably work with somebody like MI5 would be that, if you take the view of some sort of Illuminati-type group, then they would have people who've infiltrated MI5, and they would be the ones who would get the files out to the people that wanted them. In other words, it wouldn't be MI5 itself shredding them. It would be, these 2 or 3 people who've infiltrated the group at a high level and who are actually doing the work on behalf of their sort of shadowy paymasters, if you like. Right.
Now, Les in the chat room was saying that Bill Clinton said there is a government within the government and that he did not know who run it, and he was referring to information about UFOs. So he's probably mentioning one of the same quotes that I was saying I saw earlier. But to see, that was just the thing. Even the presidents don't know who these people are. They just kind of work undercover behind the scenes.
Well, I mean, yeah, again, a lot of people forget, though, particularly with the presidents, they typically, if they're lucky, they get 2 terms for 8 years. If they're not lucky, they only get 4 years. And because of the sheer wealth and breadth of work that the president has to do every day, they're not experts on every single thing. So they have people who come in and provide them summary briefings every day on which they rely. So in other words, a president or prime minister may get a briefing on a highly classified, let's say a mission, in Afghanistan or something like that. And they're given like a 2-page summary, and it might be a 10-minute summary given to the president, one of 30 or 40 10-minute summaries given every day. But that summary is just, a small part of a much bigger project or program that certain parts aren't shared with President. Maybe there's concerns that, where the briefing occurs, what if the room's booked? What if somebody isn't so, patriotic after all in the agency, and they're worried about information getting back to, the other side. And so the summary briefing is kept sort of brief and short and just to the point so the president knows what's going on. But in the event that there could be somebody who's, working for the other side as well, it doesn't compromise too much. And so that's why very often presidents don't know the full story. It's not like they're passing the buck. They just don't know the full picture, because there's just no way, they could know every aspect of everything going on in government every minute of the day. They'd never get any work done,
I bet that's true. Now, also, though, there was that one book, part of the book about the Hoover's records getting hoovered, or something to that effect. Yeah. Now, that was a deliberate by his secretary, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. As I said, the FBI has done a really good job of declassifying. A huge amount. I would say sort of maybe 80% of all its historical files. And these are the official files of the FBI. Now, it was long rumored, and it's sort of actually a proven fact now, that as well as the official FBI files, as I said, most of which are in the public domain, it's always been acknowledged that J. Edgar Hoover put together his own personal files on on literally hundreds and hundreds of people, which are being prepared by his most trusted agents, which didn't sort of technically make their way into the official FBI archives, but they stayed in Hoover's own archives, which were sort of overseen by Hoover and his secretary, Helen Gandy. And these were sort of, for Hoover's eyes only, that kind of thing. But they were very loyal to each other, Hoover and Gandy, and she was his secretary for literally decades, from the 30s till when he died in 1972. And they had this agreement that when he died, that Helen Gandy would take steps to have all his personal files destroyed. So in other words, it wasn't, as some people that incorrectly said, the FBI files from, the entire time Hoover was boss were destroyed. That isn't the case. Not hardly any of the files, the official FBI files, were destroyed when Hoover died. It was his personal files. And Hoover and Gandy actually did a very sort of broad and sweeping job to ensure that did happen. And, there are stories about the files being taken out of the Bureau's headquarters and just shredded, by the cabinet load, the filing cabinet load. And we really don't know what those files contained. Some of them were probably more sort of scandalous files on some of the files that have been released, where you've got, for example, the files on people like Marilyn Monroe that the FBI have declassified, which is a couple of hundred pages. But it's entirely possible, of course, that Hoover's files on Marilyn Monroe may have run to thousands of pages, but because they weren't part of the official file, they probably would have, sort of gone under the knife, so to speak, as well. To a degree, we're forced to speculate because we just don't know how extensive the files were, but the sheer number of them does kind of suggest that, that had we had access to them, if they'd survived the destruction order, then we probably would have had a far greater and different view on a lot of famous people, I think it's fair to say.
Oh, yeah, I'm quite sure, especially after reading your book. And I remember there was that one chapter that dealt with all those files being burnt in that fire that was suspicious as well.
Oh, yeah, this is the National Personnel Records Center in 1973, which contains, again, millions and millions of files on various military personnel. And in 1973, there was a fire there that basically took out the 6th floor, I think it was, of the NPRC building. And it destroyed literally decades of files on, again, hundreds of thousands of people. And within conspiracy circles, there have been rumors for years that the fire was supposedly started deliberately by who, nobody really knows, to ensure that certain files never reached, freedom of information or whatever, because nobody wanted them in the public domain, and with freedom of information, there's a chance there could be. Now, again, we don't have proof of that, but as I said, within conspiracy circles, there are theories that that's what happened, that somebody took a decision that, if there's a chance they're going to surface publicly, burn them, and then there's no way for anybody to get them back. So,
well, when these conspiracy
sort of
theorists,
one of those enduring mysteries.
I was going to say, when there's this conspiracy theorists come up with these kind of ideas, do they have anything at all to go on when they do it, or is it just suspicions getting out of control the better of their imagination?
No, I think, very often, you look at something like the Kennedy assassination, I personally think there are legitimate reasons for thinking that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone. I don't think Oswald was the patsy that he said he was. I think he was involved, but I don't think he was the only person involved. Was it the KGB? Was it the mafia? Was it the Cubans? We don't know. But I think somebody else was involved. So that's a legitimate case where, to a degree, we have to speculate, but also, we can track people down, interview them, and get a certain number of files. And that is a legitimate example, I think, where there is a conspiracy. When it comes to the story of the fire, I think, I've not seen hard evidence that it was started deliberately. What I've seen is because the fire to this day is unexplained. It is unexplained as to how it started. There are theories, could it have been cigarettes? Could it have been the place getting too hot, and with all that paper there, it sort of spontaneously combusted? We just don't know. But because it's a mystery. It's the fact that it is a mystery that sort of led to the conspiracy theories rather than because there's something suspicious. But the suspicions have developed because so many government files conveniently ended up destroyed, if you like.
Yeah, we used to have grain elevators over here on Studymont that have been there unused for decades. Mm-hmm. And then finally one of them exploded and caught on fire one day. Mm-hmm. I heard then and there that an actual speck of dust can ignite.
Yeah, I mean, there are examples where, paper can ignite, if it gets hot enough and the circumstances are right, it's kind of like a forest fire starting, that kind of thing. You don't need some crazy person with a box of matches, to start a forest fire. Yes, unfortunately, that does happen sometimes when you have careless campers, but sometimes a fire can just start because it's roasting hot, in the woods. Maybe that happened. Bear in mind the place that caught fire was filled with millions of pages of paper. And there was talk about sort of inadequate security issues in terms of, fire prevention and things like that. It's actually, ironically, far less good fire prevention at the NPRC than there was at certain other archives, and that may have had some sort of bearing on that issue as well.
That is true. Now, listen, we got about roughly 9 minutes left, and I didn't want you to lose a chance to mention your upcoming book. Now, I know a lot of times you're not able to tell me much very early, but is there anything you can tell us about it?
Yeah, I actually got two books coming out this year, one in June and one in September. The one that comes out in June is called Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, and it's the first book I've written on UFOs that actually has nothing to do with the UFO phenomenon itself. It has to do with people within the UFO phenomenon who've died or allegedly killed themselves or been murdered, but where there are sort of suspicious circumstances. And this relates to everything from alien abduction stories, Roswell, close encounters, scientist deaths, politician deaths, and so in other words, it's a study going back right to the 1940s to the present day, where claims have been made that somebody's suicide or car accident wasn't a suicide or car accident. And of course, it's a very controversial area. The main reason being that because everybody in ufology is human first, before they're researchers, and sometimes, unfortunately, in every walk of life, people die in car accidents or get cancer at 25, and when it happens in ufology, there's always a tendency to think it happens because they're a ufologist first rather than a human first. And so I stress this in the book, that the reason why I included certain cases and not other ones, my criteria was sort of where there are more than one angles that are relative to the death. If somebody was found dead in a car accident, then yeah, it could be a car accident. But if they were found dead in a car accident 2 weeks after somebody tried to shoot them, then, you've got a bigger picture to work with. So that's sort of the criteria I went with when there's multiple issues relative to the person, rather than just that were they unlucky enough to get cancer at 30 or whatever. And then the other book I've got coming out in September, which actually a co-authored one I did with Brad Steiger. It's called The Zombie Book, and it's like an A to Z of everything to do with zombies in movies, novels, TV shows, folklore, history, ancient traditions like voodoo, and things like the folklore and mythology relative to the raising of the dead, and entries on viruses and all that kind of thing. So sort of like a definitive A to Z of everything to do with the Walking Dead, if you like.
Okay. Actually, zombies are a pretty interesting subject. Of course, I know a lot of people that don't believe in them anymore, but it'd be kind of funny if they took over the world.
Well, it depends how you define a zombie, because everybody's perception of a zombie today, it's all to do with viruses and the end of the world and military experiments and that kind of thing. But the traditional zombie of sort of Haiti and voodoo lore is that zombies were actually sort of mind-controlled people still alive, but who were sort of rendered into a state where they believed they were dead, and they would sort of, act as slaves in Haiti and places like that. And they acted in like a zombie-like fashion, staggering around. They seemed to be in like an undead, hypnotized state, but they were actually alive. And if you watch a lot of the old movies on zombies from the 30s and 40s, like White Zombie or I Walked with a Zombie or King of the Zombies, they're all these mind-controlled, hypnotized people who are still alive but are in a slave-like zombie state. It was really only with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead in '68 that the new angle of the zombie of being somebody who dies and then reanimates through a virus, that was really only with the George Romero, and also which was inspired by Richard Matheson's novel I Am Legend, which has been made into a number of movies over the years. It was really only with Matheson's book, which inspired George Romero, that you had the viral zombie coming back from the dead. So you actually had this sort of period when there's been two different types of zombie.
Okay. Well, everybody, with that, we got 5 minutes remaining. I want to remind everybody that you can learn more about Nick or get more of his recent updates at Nick Redfern 14 FORTEAN.blogspot.com. And there's a link to his book below his description here, which will be in the archives come tomorrow. And also want to remind everybody that for at least about a month, 2 months now, I've been doing a 2-hour slot every Thursday at 1 p.m. Central Time at Revolution Radio. And tomorrow I'm going to be interviewing Daniel Unterbrink about his book, Jesus of Nazareth, over there. And I've already interviewed him over here about the same book, and it was a good interview. The book was good. I enjoyed reading it. Y'all may want to stop over there and check into that and see what he has to say. I know a lot of people who are still church-going and Christians and fundamental in the belief of the Bible is infallible would probably have trouble with it, but people who are open to the idea that history may not be everything it was written to be might be a little more open and might find some worthwhile information in it. So, come and listen for yourself and see what you think for yourself. Other than that, I'll be back here Saturday at 1 p.m. And I'll be talking to Mike George about his book, 7 Myths About Love, actually. And, Nick, is there any last-minute words you'd like to throw in there real quick?
Just in case people are interested, I'll be speaking about Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind at the MUFON San Antonio, Texas group on the last Tuesday in June. So if anybody's in San Antonio then, I'll be speaking there. And also I'll be speaking at a conference out in Joshua Tree, California in August called Contacting the Desert, where I'll be speaking about my research into the whole Contactee movement. And I'll be speaking about Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind again at the Paradigm Symposium in Minneapolis in October.
Okay. So you're going to be a part of Scotty Roberts' Symposium again?
Yeah, I like speaking up there because there's like a good wide range of different subjects. I think sometimes, particularly when it's a weekend conference, people don't just want to hear about crashed UFOs and nothing else or alien abductions and nothing else. They want it sort of mixed up a bit, where you've got a bit of variation. And that's what I like about the Paradigm Conference. You could have a lecture on the pyramids, followed by one on the Men in Black, followed by one on the Black-Eyed Children, and, then another one on Atlantis. And so it's sort of really, every 90 minutes you've got something new to focus on, and that's what I like about that conference.
Okay. Now, did I hear you say Joshua Free a minute ago?
Joshua Tree, in California. It's,
Tree, with a T, not Tree.
Yeah, Joshua Tree. No, Joshua Tree.
Yeah, I know a man named Joshua Free I've interviewed, so I thought it was the same person.
Oh, no. Joshua Tree, a town out in the desert in California, they put on this conference every year called Contacting the Desert. And, but don't worry, if you suffer from, if you don't like the heat, it's actually not held outside in the desert. It's an inside conference. But it's at Joshua Tree, which is a couple of hours outside of Los Angeles, and that's in August.
All righty. Well then, folks, don't forget to come see me tomorrow and Saturday And again, I'll be right back here next Wednesday. I don't have that in front of me right now, but I'll be posting it over the next couple of days. And in the meantime, y'all have a good day, what's left of it. And we'll see you hopefully tomorrow. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Royce.